You know who's more powerful than Al Capone? The Al Capone of cheese. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about books, and one book in particular today, and that is, of course, Shadow Ticket by Thomas Pynchon. It came out on Tuesday. I read it. It's brilliant. I enjoyed it. And now I'm going to do the thing that no one should actually do, which is try to explain to you why it is brilliant and what I thought about it after, well, reading it only once, which is, never enough for a Thomas Pynchon novel, and, no one's actually qualified to talk about it anyway, but I figured that's what we'll do. We'll do it in the usual way. I'll give you a quick, fully spoiler-free sort of rundown of what to expect from this book, why you should read it, why it might actually be a good sort of like entrance point into Thomas Pynchon's writing and so forth. And then I'll talk about some of the elements in there and the pros and all of those things. And one thing in advance, it is very, very hard to spoil a Thomas Pynchon novel, because that's not what Thomas Pynchon novels are about. So even if you are uncertain and so forth, and unsure if you want to, tackle a Thomas Pynchon novel, maybe the things that I say after we start the spoiler-free part, the spoilerish part, maybe those can help you along with that book, because one thing that I believe is, like, everyone can read Thomas Pynchon once you know what to get into, and obviously if you like the things that are happening in these books. They are not as scary as you might think, at least not the shorter ones, and this one is the second shortest one, so that might work for you. So let's try and do that. And if you want to discuss and argue with me getting stuff wrong, you can do that in the comments. I appreciate that, because, this is the kind of book that my opinion will probably change, or my ideas and thoughts will probably change every time I reread it, which I'll do a lot of times, I'm sure. My opinion will not change. I think it's brilliant. You should read it. But that was like clear from the beginning. So let's do all of these things. All right. Shadow Ticket is the 9th novel by American author Thomas Pynchon. If you know Thomas Pynchon, you may know him from his appearances on The Simpsons, the guy with the bag over the head, because famously he is not exactly a media person. There's very few pictures of him. He doesn't talk to anyone. He's 88 years old, so this may also be his final novel. You never know. And as such, it's, surrounded by all kinds of sort of like expectations, the usual stuff. Pynchon being famously one of those big American authors, often compared to people like Don DeLillo and obviously Cormac McCarthy, often deemed even more verbose, more obscure, and so forth. So there's all kinds of stuff around that. So that's the framing that you need to be aware of. It's also like the first novel after like 13 years, when in 2012, Bleeding Age came out, which is another really good book. So yeah, let's talk about what it is, what you can expect from it, and so forth before we go into detail. It's, on the surface, a detective story. We more or less constantly follow private detective Hicks McTaggart, who starts out in Milwaukee in 1932 and ends up in Budapest in 1933. He's sent on a journey to find the, missing runaway heiress of a large fortune, that is, in this case, Daphne Airmond, heiress to a large cheese syndicate, because, we're in Wisconsin, so cheese is kind of the thing. And that is the basic plot. Obviously, this being a Thomas Pynchon novel, that's not what this book is about. So largely, this book is split into more or less like two halves. The first half taking place in 1932, Milwaukee and Chicago, looking at, organized crime, the last gasps of the Prohibition, and McTaggart sort of navigating those places between organized crime, between, different gangs, and working as a private detective, as a detective in a detective agency, and trying to avoid taking on the job of finding Daphne Airmond, which, makes sense because he has had, at least one earlier encounter with her and so forth. And there's a lot of, stuff happening, a lot of like setting building, a lot of introducing characters that may or may not come in handy later on, or that may or may not show up, all of that kind of stuff. And it paints a picture of, the United States in, the last days of the Hoover administration, right before FDR gets voted in. It's the Great Depression. It's all of those wonderful things happening sort of around that time. That is the first half. And then the second half obviously takes place in Budapest in, autumn, winter 1932 and the beginnings of 1933, which is a interesting time for a country like Hungary, and a city like Budapest, after the breaking up of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the rise of fascism in Italy, of course, in Germany, in Austria, and those places, and the establishment of the Soviet Union, and of course the rise of communism and socialism in other places. So it's a weirdly international city with a lot of spying going on, a lot of different intelligence work going on, a lot of assassinations going on, all kinds of weird international espionage happening in Budapest, and that is where our private detective Hicks McTaggart ends up having adventures trying to find Daphne Airmont, or maybe once he's found Daphne Airmont, doing other things to actually get her to go back to the United States, which is, officially his job. So that is basically the structure of the novel. And basically what you can see is that it is the telling of two stories about two different places, so being America and Europe at the same time, going through very similar sort of eras, periods, economically, politically, and so forth. And the question is usually which one goes which direction. And now, obviously, in hindsight, we kind of know what happened, but this book focuses on that time where it wasn't really clear which continent goes full-on fascist and which continent goes maybe a more democratic direction. So that is what you can expect from this book. It is full of historical allusions, references, jokes, and so forth, because this is a Thomas Pynchon novel. But because of the fact that we focus mostly fully on Hicks McTaggart, with obviously asides and so forth, but he's mostly in almost every scene somewhere. It's probably one of the more accessible Thomas Pynchon novels, and because it has sort of the plot of a detective novel, that is also what makes it somewhat more accessible. So that's what you can expect from it. I think it's a really good novel. I think you should read it. It's roughly 300 pages long, so it is relatively short for a Thomas Pynchon novel, which may make it a very good sort of starting point, together with Inherent Vice, which I think is another really good one, or of course The Crying of Lot 49, which is Pynchon's shortest novel. I think the latter two, I think Inherent Vice and Shadow Ticket are better options, because the later 2000s Thomas Pynchon is somewhat more, less verbose and less obscure, and while there is still conspiracies, paranoia, and all the other stuff, I think it's slightly more accessible to people living on possibly growing up right now, whereas something like Crying of Lot 49, being written in the 60s and 70s, does a lot of stuff that we may just not remember if we are, younger or haven't been around in that time. So I think that's one of the reasons why this one might work. So yeah, you should definitely read this if you're into Thomas Pynchon. I mean, if you're a Pynchon fan, you probably already have started reading it, I just assume. If you are not a Thomas Pynchon fan yet and wanted to try him, this is definitely one that might really work. One warning, it is still a Thomas Pynchon novel, so there is a lot of absurdism going on here. There's a lot of incredibly ridiculous stuff happening. Names are ridiculous. And while there are very serious themes, topics, and so forth happening, you need to be willing to go through a lot of humor, ridiculous humor that works for a very specific type of person, like me. So be aware of that. Seriousness is in the themes. It's not in the, dialogue. It's not in the descriptions. It's not in those kind of things. You need to sort of split those two things apart, which I think if you have seen One Battle After Another, the new Paul Thomas Anderson movie that is, of course, based on, or loosely based on Vineland, another Thomas Pynchon novel, you kind of get the idea there where while it is incredibly dark when it comes to, fascism taking over America, the violence against immigrants and all of that kind of stuff, the plot in the foreground, right, is ridiculous. And there's a lot of really dumb slapstick humor and all kinds of stuff happening. And that is very much the Thomas Pynchon experience. And if you can't deal with that, then I suspect none of his books will actually really be for you. So that's the spoiler-free part. Now go and read the book. As I said, it's very short. You can read it. If you want me to explain more in detail, this will happen from now on, but there will be potentially spoilers here. As I said, it's kind of difficult to spoil a Thomas Pynchon novel because plot resolution, not necessarily what he's about. All right, let's do that. All right. If you're still here, I hope you've either read it or don't care about spoilers. Let's talk about what this book does, where it kind of fits in, and all of those things. And if we look at Thomas Pynchon's work in general, that's what I want to look at first, and then I want to look at the specific stylistic things and choices that he usually makes in most of his books, and look at like how they show up in this specific book, right? So first of all, like almost all of Thomas Pynchon's work, novels, cover what I would call the long 20th century, right? And that is starting with Against the Day in the late 19th century and ending with Bleeding Edge in 2001, 2002, right around 9/11. That's what most of his books cover, with the exception of Mason and Dixon, which obviously covers, well, the Mason and Dixon expedition. So this is very much Thomas Pynchon's focus, and they usually focus on, well, the global world, but like mostly Europe and the United States, with obviously the heaviest focus on the United States, to explain sort of like why we end up in the place that we ended up, usually at the time when he was writing a book. So, you know, Violent, being written in the late 80s and early 90s, looks at like America after 8 years of Reagan, and Bleeding Edge obviously looks at, well, America 2001, 2002, and while this book covers the 1930s, it very much is also written from a 2024-25 perspective. So it covers that sort of like hole between V on the one hand, and which was Pynchon's first novel, and Gravity's Rainbow, which is Pynchon's not longest novel, but probably best known novel, which obviously focusing on Tyrone Slothrop, looks at the end of World War II. That is a hole that that like earlier wasn't filled by Pynchon's novels in a way. The 1920s, late 1920s, early 1930s, the time of like the Great Depression, the beginning of the New Deal, that area has sort of like so far not existed in Pynchon's work. Obviously the 50s, 60s, 70s being where a lot of his stuff kind of focuses on. So he does look at this specific place. One thing that is always really important, and once again is here, the things like Pynchon likes to focus on moments, like pivotal moments in history, and we'll come back to that later on. But like obviously the 1930s are such a sort of like pivotal, weird moment between like different political systems, between well, World War I and World War II, where stuff is in flux and weird and could go all kinds of directions. And this book very clearly picks, well, another one of these. And obviously the 1930s is sort of like where the rise of fascism is sort of in the background, and, you know, rise of fascist systems is something that Pynchon always looks at in all kinds of ways, right? No matter which book he's writing about, it's usually about like systems of power taking over, and individual freedom and societal freedom and so forth, often being crushed by it. That is just a major theme in Pynchon's work in general, and, you know, looking at the world right now, he might be onto something there, right? What I found interesting for me personally is last year I read Polostan, which is obviously the newest Neil Stephenson novel, and it covers roughly the same period. And there are, in fact, even like overlapping bits and pieces. One of them being the idea, well, that there are X-ray machines in shoe shops, so you can look at the, well, bones in your foot to actually, you know, determine something about potentially determining something about what kind of shoe to wear, which is mostly a marketing thing, which was shown up in Chicago during yet another Columbian exhibition. And that fact is mentioned both here in Shadow Ticket and is a plot point in Polostan. Obviously, that's no big surprise, because Stevenson, clearly influenced by Thomas Pynchon, often has a similar approach to writing in his newer novels. That is a combination of whimsy and absurdist elements with a darker theme in the background. So I found it interesting to compare the two, and I think Pynchon goes in a different direction that is less science fiction focused. Stevenson, usually being the nerd, picks those ridiculous elements and bits and pieces out of history that he's really fascinated in, and then mostly focuses on developments of science, technology, and so forth, and does not so much look at the development of political systems and where they kind of go. That's partly because Stevenson is very clearly very much a libertarian in a lot of ways, and doesn't want to make like political statements, and accepts history as something that has already happened. And we can see that with Polostan, where those larger ideas of like the rise of fascism don't necessarily show up with, the events around the breaking and destruction of the bonus army being just narrated, and it's kind of clear who's the bad guys, but it's never made like any clearer statements like where that all comes from, where the depression is just like a thing that happened, because acknowledging that it's because of Hoover's mismanagement in large places would mean criticizing certain aspects of libertarian philosophy. So I just found this interesting, whereas like technological elements do play a role here, and we'll come back to them later. They are used in different ways and look more at sort of like the societal impacts of specific technologies, or the way they frame how we see the world in a lot of ways. That is something that Pynchon always comes back to, and he does so here as well. So that's something that I wanted to bring up. The next thing that I wanted to look at before we move on into like specifics in a way is the character of the detective. Because Pynchon has had a lot of like investigative characters over the years. Technically, Oedipa Mass in Crying of Lot 49 is investigating something. It's more explicit, obviously, with Inherent Vice, and Doc Spatello being clearly, being officially a private detective, and Maxine Tarnow in Bleeding Edge also being very much investigating as a private person, but doing a lot of like investigating civilian and investigating that has become such a hallmark of the internet era, which makes sense because this book is obviously, set in 2001. So I thought it might be interesting to compare that. Incidentally, Mass Biochips, one of the big evil corporations in William Gibson's Sprawl trilogy, is named after Oedipa Mass. So you can see Pynchon as an author has always had a huge impact on science fiction and cyberpunk authors in particular. Just wanted to bring that up for a moment. Anyway, let's look at those three major detectives here, those being Tarnow, Hicks, McTaggart, and Doc Spatello, because these are like his last three novels in publication order right now, and we can see what he does with different detectives. So Maxine Tarnow clearly, is drawn into this as a, investigator, but more on like a private element, slowly descending into paranoia and discovering sort of like different state and so forth conspiracies. And that is one approach to doing that, having a private person that gets drawn into events and is turned into a investigator. On the other hand, Doc Spatello is a private detective and has a personal connection once again to a missing person, and is doing his specific thing. And the final person here, Hicks McTaggart, is a detective, but he works for an agency, and that is sort of like, we have these different persons, someone doing this on their own for interest and not getting paid, someone doing that on their own being paid, and now the final version is someone who's just a cog in a machine, has to do what their boss says, and has to adhere to the whims of a large corporation that is not actually explaining anything, is not taking care of any of his personal wishes or anything of the sorts. He's just an element in capitalism. And in that regard, I think it's an interesting sort of evolution of the investigator character in Pynchon's work, written in a time where work has become more and more precarious, and where most of us are at the whims of large corporations that don't give a fuck about anything we do. And that hope that was around the early 2000s of the internet going like, well, maybe we can actually do stuff on our own, that has completely vanished in this regard. And I think that is a deliberate choice, and one that I feel is important. We'll see where all of these detectives end up once we've come to the end of the book, sort of. But these are just like some preliminaries. And as I said, like, one of the things with Pynchon is usually the sort of like confrontation or the complement between whimsy and absurdism on the one hand, and darkness on the other hand. And sort of absurdism being sort of the thing that shifts between whimsy and darkness, because the absurd obviously can be both. And I want to look at three aspects of that to show how Pynchon does that. And I want to start with names in Pynchon. Because names in Pynchon are always whimsical. Like, Pynchon's names are always really over the top, weirdly descriptive, and whimsical, often added with nicknames, and that are often jokes in themselves. So they can be off-putting because you're reading a serious book that everyone tells you, on the world tells you that this is serious capital L literature, and so forth, and then you still have, characters that are have just the most ridiculous, weird names showing up on the page. Obviously, Hope Wingate being one of them. Hicks McTaggart, definitely also not your most serious name. There's a lot of that kind of stuff going on. And I think that is one sort of like approach of Pynchon, because a lot of what Pynchon does is a bit like a magic trick, right? Where you're supposed to watch the hands, but you don't do that because he's very much distracting you with ridiculous names, ridiculous jokes, and the whimsy and absurdism. While in the background, he does he builds up the darkness, and that I think is interesting to watch and to see. And the way this works, I think, for him in particular, is through his very distinctive prose style. Like, Pynchon has a very distinctive writing style. His sentence structure is very unique in that he has long sentences that often use a lot of like gerunds, like a lot of like, he starts with this thing and then moves to like passing along, doing lots of like gerunds, basically moving along the sentence and ending up with something very different on the other hand, which is, that movement that I tried to explain between like whimsy to darkness. And the sentence structure, I think, does in a lot of ways reflect that, which is really clever, right? I mean, obviously, the man knows how to write books. You may not like what he's writing, but he certainly knows how to use language. And that, I think, is important to understand, because if you don't like that specific style of prose, then Pynchon can be hard to read, and it's very different from like something we encounter in a lot of contemporary fiction, whether it's literary fiction or much more like fantasy or science fiction. It's just a very different style. It's much more it's much closer to some things that people like Umberto Eco obviously use, and Eco being very similar in approach in a lot of ways to Thomas Pynchon for obvious reasons. And I found that interesting and worth pointing out. And I think maybe being aware of the style of sentence can make it easier to follow them when you kind of know how these sentences are structured and how they are working and where they are going. So that is sort of the second level. We start out with names that are whimsical but often have like deeper meanings underneath. And then we move from there to sentence structures that start at some point and then have like this floating part in the middle and end in a different place. And now we come to the next level, and that is, of course, scenes. Because Pynchon does something that can be very disorienting, and I think that is on purpose, and which is, you often have dialogue or scenes that start somewhere and you have two people talking to each other, and then there is a mention of a sort of thought that one of the characters, that the focus character has, that often is something that they remember, and then the dialogue continues and you realize that now you're actually in that other scene mid-paragraph. And since Pynchon doesn't necessarily use a lot of like dialogue tags in any way, shape or form, it can take a while to realize that the dialogue that this scene started with is not the dialogue that this scene ends with, and the people talking at the end are not necessarily the same people that were talking at the beginning, sometimes people that weren't even in the same place or in the same time. And that is very much something that Pynchon has always done and will always do, and is doing here. And I think it's important to sort of like understand that and pay attention and notice that moment where we have that shift. Once again, this is this shift from like starting at some point and ending up at a different point. That does, however, still explain what happened in that first part of the dialogue and is important for later on. And that confusion, I feel, is what makes Pynchon reading Pynchon sometimes difficult, but also so rewarding because you can get a lot out of that approach. And I hate using the word dense because it often kind of has all these sort of like elitist connotations, but these are very dense texts in that they pack so much meaning through these techniques of like long sentences, shifting scene within like a paragraph, within basically a dialogue between within conversations, and switching from like an outside perspective of like this is two people talking, and they shift into the head of one of the characters, and you end up on the other side in like another conversation, which is then once again written as if it is happening right now. And you may then move on in that specific timeline in the past, move to the next scene, and jump forward again. So everything is always in flux. And as you may remember, what I said earlier is that Pynchon's stories are very often set in places and times that are also in flux, where different things are possible. And that is something that happens a lot with Pynchon, and I think it reflects like his language and his scene composition, his paragraph composition reflects that sort of like looking at pivotal moments, at points where parallel time tracks sort of like split up, and where things can go different directions. That is what he's doing here by using this approach to building a story. So to keep with that, let's look at this, like having sort of like parallel worlds and parallel time tracks and parallel histories is something that we've seen in a lot of Thomas Pynchon's books. And there's often sort of like some vague communication between different timelines, between different worlds. Sometimes people can move from one to the other. Sometimes people see people from another place and can talk to them. Sometimes they dream something. That is just like Pynchon's idea of like, there are moments in time where few people could potentially change the course of history to the better. Usually they fail, and we end up on our timeline, which is usually not necessarily the best timeline. But looking at these moments and having sort of like precognition, or at least premonitions of what could go in different directions, is very much part of that. These ideas of like switching between worlds or time tracks or tracks of history and meaning, which is interesting because what we find here is like the way he uses technology for that is one of his approaches of that, because technology usually, is a scientific development, but it is then shaped by the society that we live and the people live in, and the people who have the power to shape technology have the power to shape the world and history. And I think there are two interesting ones here, and they obviously sort of like are near to each other, like language-wise, because Thomas Pynchon obviously loves to play with language, and that's radio and that's radioactivity. One famous thing, obviously, being the radioactive cheese. That is sort of like an idea that Bruno Ehrmann at the beginning develops, and it's just like a joke before he becomes the Al Capone of cheese, head of like an international cheese syndicate and all of that kind of stuff. And it looks at the idea that radioactivity, while discovered in like the 20s and 30s, became incredibly popular, and people use it for all kinds of dangerous shit, like, to make the hands of a watch glow, to use it for all kinds of other stuff, because everyone thought like a radioactivity would be a really, really cool thing. What it turns out to be is obviously that we use nuclear power to, blow up cities in Japan and start the Cold War and so forth. So we have one technology that starts out really, really positively and optimistically, and ends up in a very, very dark place. And at the same time, we have radio, which the youth is picking up on in this book, and using radio to, find conversations and pick up calls from sometimes places that maybe don't even exist, that are non-existent or are parallel worlds and so forth. And there we have this other technology that is kind of scary to people in the beginning, and older characters are somewhat in awe or not exactly friendly towards the technology of radio and radio communication. And we know that like communication in those kind of ways has turned out to be a positive over time. So we have those basically crossing over, what you might call a chiasmus in rhetoric, by technology crossing over in that regard. And I think that is interesting and shows once again how these pivotal moments are what Pynchon focuses on, and Shadow Ticket does just that once again. All right, now let's look at the final sort of like elements here that I feel are important, and that is As I already mentioned, with history, it's the same thing, where we are in the 1930s, and there are some hints at this, where, the US could have turned really fascist. And there's even like a mention of the business plot, which, if you don't know what that was, well, look it up. But it's a bunch of business people who wanted to coup FDR and put a military dictator or military-led government in his place. Luckily, they chose the wrong general, in this case, Smedley Butler, who, ratted them out to Congress and so forth. But we could have lived in a world where the US was led by someone else. In this book, the mention is Dr. MacArthur. And we all know how that would have turned out with someone who wanted to nuke Korea in the 1950s. It's not going to... Yeah. And Europe could have gone differently, because this is, remember, this is set in 1932 and early 1933. So this is right before the Nazis took power in Germany. And we see sort of like this crossing point where one world is one where Europe turns, socialist and or leftist or democratic in one way or another, and the US turned fascist. And one is the one where the US stay on a democratic course, at least for a while longer, and Europe turns very authoritarian in the 1930s. And that I think is where this sort of like crossing or splitting of paths, splitting of histories, once again, is key to the story in a lot of ways. And we obviously see the usual thing, which is we have a secret organization that runs history, makes sure that we end up on the more restrictive side of things. In this case, it's that international cheese syndicate that sometimes works together with Nazis and starts building up anti-Semitism and so forth. And sometimes it's, in older books, obviously, Crying of Lot 49 famously, it's Trastero, the secret post office service, and so forth. We have those kind of groups in every book, and they are very ruthless, and people have to sort of like eke out a place for themselves and their personal lives and so forth, despite the forces of absolutism, the forces of authoritarian regimes, the forces of capitalism and fascism, and have to find these places. And Pynchon always uses a lot of pages to explore these more anarchist, more free societies. Here it's the motorcycle gangs riding through the former Austro-Hungarian Empire. There's a reason why this a lot of this story focuses on Fiume, now Rijeka in Croatia, wonderful city, which was occupied by D'Annunzio, a famous Italian general and one of the early people that build up fascism in a lot of ways. It's always been a weird sort of like zone between places, and these sort of like weird zones that are in flux are, as I said, like a Pynchon thing. And so there's a reason why Fiume is one of these places here. And I just wanted to make sure that we are aware of the fact that these like open places are mentioned here and that freedom is explored. But one thing that happens with Pynchon usually is that broader societal change never really happens, and there is that step back on like the personal and the private in a lot of ways. And that is where I want to slowly move to the end of this conversation, right? See, if we come back to our three detectives here, they all sort of end up in the same place, which is after getting more and more confused by the world and getting more and more paranoid, they usually try to find like some form of personal place to go. And Maxine Tarnow obviously focuses more on her family that was broken at the beginning, and there is at least hope for some reconciliation with her husband and so forth. Doc Spatello famously drives off into the fog, where there is possibilities for the future, and Hicks McTaggart remains for the time being in Europe because in this world the US seems to be destined for fascism and state control, and does not want someone who has seen too much of freedom sort of like stay around. What is also important is that like they can't find meaning in the larger world because there is no such meaning, so they focus on like personal connections with friends, families, those elements in a lot of ways, relationships. And there are a couple of these, and famously, this ends with Hicks actually maybe finding love, at least for a moment, and also getting a letter from Skeet, his young sort of like admirer in all the way back in Milwaukee, who is looking forward to the bright future in California. And there are, name parallels that might hint that Skeet might be connected to the characters from Vineland, potentially. We don't know. So this focus on the personal is, and I think it's one of those elements of Pynchon's writing that often get sort of ignored, or at least fall to the wayside, because Pynchon is incredibly good at creating these familial relationships, romantic relationships. That human element is something that always shines through in Pynchon, but often gets sort of like pushed to the side by the ridiculous language, by the whimsy, by all of these other elements. And the fact that these books usually end on individual characters finding personal hope for the future, and often looking at like a younger generation that may have the chance to change the world the next time one of these points of flux comes around, one of these pivotal moments comes around. That, I think, is important. It's like find personal happiness, create situations for the future where the next generation can maybe make that choice and maybe actually get it right for once. And that, I think, is hopeful. That is positive. I really, really appreciate that about Pynchon, because while, the world is really dark, hoping for the future is one thing that we should never, ever give up. And that is, at the end of the day, a very progressive, a very anarchist, very leftist sort of approach to the world, which is clearly something that Pynchon always puts into his books. So yeah, these are my thoughts on Shadow Ticket after reading it once. They may change in the future. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you read the book, or I hope you plan to read the book. If you have thoughts, if you have ideas, put them down in the comments. I read them. Try to comment and reply. If you like this, give it a like. I don't know, share it, subscribe, join the Patreon if you want to give me money, join the channel if you want to give me money, use the PayPal link if you want to give me money. You don't have to give me money. Obviously, I appreciate it, but you don't have to. Mostly, I want you to read good books. Mostly, I want you to be good people, make sure that we have a brighter future. I'll see you very soon, and until then, thanks and cheers.